Two people can share a delusion the way two people share a language, so completely, so naturally, that neither one can see where the words end and the world begins. Margaret is 53 years old. She has not left her house in 11 months. Her sister Carol, 51, has not left either. Together, they believe the neighbors are systematically poisoning the water supply. They believe this with the same unshakable certainty that you believe the floor will hold your weight when you step out of bed. They have installed filters on every tap. They drink only bottled water purchased from a specific store 2 towns over, carried in by a nephew who does not understand what he is enabling. They have constructed a detailed log, handwritten, cross-referenced, documenting what they describe as observable symptoms: headaches, fatigue, a strange taste on Tuesdays. The log is meticulous. The logic internally is airtight. And if you sat across from either one of them and listened long enough, something about the certainty in their voices might make you pause. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. Folie à deux is a French phrase that translates literally to madness of two. In clinical literature, it is classified under the broader category of shared delusional disorder, a condition in which a primary individual, called the inducer, holds a fixed false belief, and a secondary individual, called the induced, comes to adopt that belief as their own through sustained close contact. The DSM-5 folds this under other specified schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, which tells you something about how difficult the condition is to categorize. It does not fit neatly. It never has. What makes Folie à deux distinct from ordinary influence, from the kind of persuasion that happens in cults, in abusive relationships, in political movements, is the clinical severity and the structural mirroring. The induced person does not merely agree with the inducer. They come to experience the delusion as a first-person reality. The belief is not borrowed, it is inhabited. The condition is rare, or at least rarely diagnosed. Published case studies number in the hundreds over more than a century of literature. But clinicians who specialize in psychotic disorders suggest the true prevalence is likely higher, that many cases are never identified because the pair involved never seeks treatment, or because the delusion is never sufficiently tested against external reality to trigger a crisis. The relationship between inducer and induced is almost always one of significant emotional dependency and social isolation. The pairing is most commonly 2 siblings, a married couple, or a parent and adult child. Occasionally, the phenomenon has been documented in larger groups, folie à trois, folie à famille, but the dyadic form is by far the most studied. What seems to happen, in simplified terms, is this. One person, the inducer, develops a genuine psychotic delusion, typically rooted in an underlying condition such as schizophrenia, delusional disorder, or severe depression with psychotic features. The induced person, through prolonged isolation with the inducer and a pre-existing emotional dependence on them, gradually loses access to the corrective feedback that contact with the broader world provides. The inducer's reality becomes the only available reality. The delusion fills the space where external truth used to be. Margaret and Carol's story did not begin with poisoned water. It began, as these things often do, with something much smaller, something almost reasonable. Margaret was, by every account that could be assembled from those who knew her, a capable and even warm person through most of her adult life. She worked for nearly 2 decades as an administrative coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company, the kind of role that requires someone who notices things, who tracks details, who remembers what was said in a meeting 3 months ago when everyone else has moved on. Colleagues remembered her as organized, occasionally intense, privately funny. She was not, in those years, the kind of person who frightened anyone. Carol, the younger of the two, had spent her working life in closer proximity to Margaret than most siblings do. She had followed her older sister to the same city after their parents died within 18 months of each other, their father first, then their mother, in a grief that Carol described to her general practitioner, years later, as something that broke something in her that never fully healed. Carol had always been the more dependent of the two. Friends who knew them both described a relationship that was loving but asymmetric, Margaret the decision-maker. Carol the one who deferred. They had lived together, the two of them, since Carol's marriage ended in her late 30s. By the time they were both in their late 40s, they shared a house, shared finances, shared most meals, and socialized almost exclusively with each other. The narrowing had been gradual. It did not feel like narrowing from the inside. It felt like simplicity, like choosing what mattered. Margaret's employer restructured when she was 50. She was offered early retirement rather than a lateral reassignment, and she accepted it, partly out of pride and partly because Carol had recently been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition that required monitoring. The autoimmune condition was real. It was manageable. But it became, in the months that followed, the first lens through which Margaret began to reinterpret the world around them. She started researching, extensively, and Margaret had always been very good at research. The first sign, in retrospect, was a change in how Margaret talked about Carol's condition. What began as legitimate health advocacy, reading studies, questioning medication dosages, asking doctors pointed follow-up questions, gradually shifted in tone and scope. She began to express the view that Carol's flares were environmental in origin, that something in their immediate surroundings was triggering them. This is not, on its face, an unreasonable hypothesis. Environmental factors do play a role in autoimmune disease. The concern itself was credible. The problem was the direction it moved in over time. Margaret began to document. The log that Carol's nephew would later carry to and from the store. That log started as a health diary, a record of Carol's symptoms cross-referenced with weather, diet, and activity. It was responsible. It was the kind of thing a good caregiver does. But over the following months, the entries began to include new variables: water quality, soil reports, the smell from a neighbor's yard, the timing of a municipal maintenance truck that appeared on their street every few weeks. Each entry was neat, precise, and attached to the next by a chain of inference that, looked at from the outside, required significant leaps, but from inside the log appeared seamless. Carol read every entry. Carol discussed every entry with Margaret. Carol began contributing her own observations. She noticed, she said, that her symptoms were worse on the days Margaret had flagged. She was not wrong about the pattern. The pattern was real. The explanation was not. By the time they had been living inside this interpretive framework for approximately 8 months, Carol had come to believe in it with the same conviction as Margaret. Not because she had been pressured, not because she was afraid to disagree, but because she had been immersed in one reality for so long that the other had simply faded. When her GP gently raised concerns at a routine appointment, asking whether the water contamination belief had been verified with any external authority, Carol did not become defensive. She became confused. The question seemed to her like asking whether gravity had been verified. Of course it was real. She had watched it happen. She had felt it. The period that Carol's nephew would later describe as the worst of it lasted approximately 4 months. By this point, the sisters had stopped allowing anyone into the house whom they did not already trust completely. They had ceased contact with 2 neighbors following what they described as threatening behavior. In actuality, one neighbor had knocked on the door to return a piece of misdelivered mail, and the other had inquired about the state of their front garden. Both encounters had been brief and unremarkable. Margaret had interpreted them as surveillance. The belief system had also expanded. The water contamination, which had begun as a specific and local concern, had grown to encompass a broader and more generalized threat. Margaret had concluded that the contamination was deliberate, that it was coordinated, that it targeted their household specifically, and that it was connected to a complaint she had filed with their local council several years earlier regarding a planning dispute. The planning dispute had been real. The connection she had drawn from it was not. Carol had incorporated this expanded framework entirely. When asked, she could articulate the timeline of the conspiracy with the same fluency and confidence as Margaret, the same language, the same reference points, the same emotional certainty. Clinically, what was happening fell within what researchers term the primary and secondary delusional dyad. Margaret retained the role of active ideation, generating and elaborating the belief. Carol retained the role of what some literature describes as the passive recipient, whose delusional content was maintained through proximity and reinforcement rather than through independent psychotic process. But from inside the house, there were no roles. There were only two people who knew the truth. The crisis that led to intervention occurred when Margaret contacted emergency services to report that she and Carol were victims of an ongoing chemical assault. First responders arrived, assessed the property, and found no evidence of contamination. A welfare check was initiated. Within 48 hours, both women had been referred for psychiatric evaluation. The nephew, who had driven them to the hospital, would later say that the hardest thing was watching them comfort each other in the waiting room, quietly, completely united, certain that what was happening to them was exactly what they had predicted would happen when they tried to tell someone. What happened in that house over the course of roughly 2 years is, from a clinical standpoint, a near textbook example of how the social architecture of close relationships can erode the epistemic foundations of one person while preserving them in another. Margaret's delusional disorder, which, following evaluation, was determined to be a primary psychotic condition with no identifiable underlying cause beyond predisposition and stress, provided the structural content, the specific belief, the interpretive framework, the emotional urgency. Carol's pre-existing dependency on Margaret, combined with prolonged isolation from corrective social input, created the conditions under which that content could be transmitted. Neurologically, researchers have proposed several mechanisms. One is the role of social reality testing, the ongoing, largely unconscious process by which we calibrate our beliefs against the responses of others. In healthy social environments, delusional ideation is continuously challenged. People around us behave as though the water is not poisoned, and this behavior functions as a form of corrective data. When the social environment is reduced to a single other person who shares the belief, that corrective mechanism fails. The brain has no contradictory data to process. The belief becomes, functionally, unchallenged truth. There's also evidence from attachment research that individuals with high dependency orientations, people for whom a primary relationship constitutes the core of their sense of safety, are more susceptible to adopting the belief systems of the person they depend on. This is not manipulation in any intentional sense. It is a feature of how human cognition manages threat. When the alternative to believing is losing the relationship, the mind tends to believe. The important clinical note is this: when Carol was separated from Margaret during the evaluation period, her delusional beliefs began to attenuate within days. Without the reinforcement of Margaret's certainty, without the daily architecture of the shared framework, Carol's own reality testing began to reassert itself. She became uncertain, then uncomfortable, then slowly she began to express doubt. Margaret did not. Margaret's beliefs held. This asymmetry, this is the distinguishing marker of Folie. Deux. It tells you who the illness belongs to. Margaret was admitted for inpatient psychiatric treatment. She was diagnosed with persistent delusional disorder and began antipsychotic medication. Progress was slow. The beliefs did not dissolve rapidly or cleanly. They eroded over months, first at the edges, where she began to acknowledge uncertainty about specific details, and then more centrally, though her treatment team noted that even after 12 months of consistent medication and therapy, certain aspects of the original framework remained resistant. She was eventually discharged to supported outpatient care. Carol was not admitted. Following the period of separation during the initial evaluation, her delusional symptoms diminished significantly without medication. She engaged in individual therapy, which focused on the patterns of dependency that had made her vulnerable to the shared belief system in the first place. She moved in with her nephew for a period. She described the experience of recovering from the shared delusion as deeply disorienting, not because the beliefs had felt wrong while she held them, but because they had felt so completely, obviously right. She and Margaret have had limited contact since. Their treatment teams recommended, and both women eventually agreed, that the closeness of their relationship, the very thing that had sustained them through the deaths of their parents, through divorce, through decades, was also the thing that had made this possible. Whether that contact will increase over time is not yet clear. Some cases of folie à deux, once treated, allow the relationship to resume safely. Others do not. The literature is not definitive on what predicts which outcome. What Margaret and Carol's case asks us to sit with is not the strangeness of their belief. It is the ordinariness of its origin. Two people who loved each other. A shrinking world. One mind that broke and another that followed. Not out of weakness, but out of loyalty, out of decades of trust, out of the same deep human need to share reality with someone. The mind is not a sealed vessel. It is porous. It is social. It was built over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to be updated by the people around it. That is usually a feature. In rare and particular circumstances, it becomes something else entirely. If you found this case study worth your time, there is more in the archive. The conditions we explore here are rare. The mechanisms behind them are not. If you like unsettling psychology, like and subscribe for a new diagnosis each week.